The night I realized something was wrong wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your chest and doesn't leave. I was standing in my kitchen, holding my phone, rereading a message that made my stomach drop. On the surface, my life looked simple. I worked as a shift supervisor at a neighborhood grocery store. Long hours, sore feet, steady paycheck. Nothing fancy, but it paid my rent and kept the lights on. I was dating Mark for almost 3 years. He worked construction, came home dusty and tired, and liked to tell people we were solid. I believed that for a long time. Or maybe I wanted to. At first, he was attentive in a quiet way. He remembered my coffee order. He picked me up after late shifts. He'd say things like, "I just worry about you." And I thought that meant love. Little things started to feel off. He'd joke about my job in front of his friends, calling it cute or temporary. If I got upset, he'd laugh and say I was too sensitive. When I wanted to see my friends, he'd sigh like it was a burden. "I just thought we'd spend time together," he'd say. If I went anyway, he'd be cold the rest of the night. Money became a quiet battlefield. He'd forget his wallet when we went out. He'd ask me to cover things and promise to pay me back later. Later never came, but somehow it was always my fault for bringing it up. He didn't yell. That's what made it confusing. He spoke calmly while saying things that made me doubt myself. If I questioned him, he'd tilt his head and say, "I never said that," like I was inventing problems. I started keeping notes in my phone, not to accuse him, but to reassure myself that things had actually happened. Dates, words, small moments that felt wrong. My world shrank without me noticing. I stopped talking about work because he said it stressed him out. I stopped wearing certain clothes because he said they attracted the wrong attention. The message that night was from my sister. She asked if everything was okay because Mark had told her I was having a rough time mentally and might need space. I had never said that to him. I stared at the screen, feeling something crack open. He was talking about me without me, shaping a story where I was unstable and he was patient. When I asked him about it, he smiled and said he was just trying to help. "You know how you get," he added softly. "I'm just looking out for you." That was the moment I stopped defending him in my head. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded and listened, already feeling the ground shift under my feet. For the first time, I wondered how long this had been happening, and what else he was willing to say about me when I wasn't in the room. Once I noticed the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. Every disagreement followed the same script, and I couldn't believe how long I'd played my role without realizing it. If I told him something hurt me, he'd stay calm and quiet until I sounded emotional. Then he'd sigh and say, "See? This is what I'm talking about." Somehow, my reaction became the problem, not what he did. He started checking my schedule more closely. If I worked late, he'd ask who else was there. If I didn't answer right away, he'd say he was worried something happened, but his eyes would scan my face like he was looking for a lie. He'd joke about me forgetting things. If I corrected him, he'd smirk and say, "That's not how I remember it." After a while, I caught myself apologizing even when I was sure I was right. The worst part was how he handled other people. In front of friends, he'd put his arm around me and talk about how patient he was, how I'd been going through a lot. People nodded at him with sympathy. No one asked me what was wrong. One night after work, I found him going through my phone. He didn't even look guilty. He just said, "If there's nothing to hide, why are you upset?" When I took my phone back, he laughed and told me I was being dramatic. A week later, my manager pulled me aside. She asked if everything was okay at home because someone had called the store, claiming to be concerned about my well-being. My chest tightened. I knew exactly who it was. When I confronted Mark, he didn't deny it. He said he was scared for me, that I'd been forgetful, emotional, overwhelmed. He said he thought having people keep an eye on me would help. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed conversations in my head, matching his words to the outcomes. Friends pulling back, co-workers treating me carefully, my own confidence shrinking. I started quietly checking things. I looked through old messages. I asked my sister what he'd told her, exactly. I compared notes, dates, phrases. The stories didn't match. He was building a version of me that made him look like the reasonable one, the supportive one. And if I ever pushed back too hard, that version would be ready to explain why I wasn't reliable. The breaking point came during a small argument about money. I asked him calmly when he planned to pay me back. He stared at me and said, "You're imagining things again. I never borrowed that much." I showed him my notes. Dates. Amounts. He shrugged and said, "If you're keeping records like this, maybe you really do need help." Something went quiet inside me. Not sad, not angry, just clear. I stopped arguing. I told him I was tired and went to bed early. He kissed my forehead and said he loved me. Lying there in the dark, I realized I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't overreacting. I was being managed. And I decided that if he wanted to control the story, I'd let him finish telling it, right up until it collapsed under its own weight. I didn't confront him again. That was the first real change. I became agreeable, quiet, easy. He relaxed almost immediately, like a man who thinks the storm has passed. While he felt safe, I started paying attention. Not emotionally, methodically. I stopped writing notes in my phone and switched to a small notebook I kept at work, tucked behind the break room lockers. I wrote down exact phrases he used, who he said them to, when. I noted dates when friends stopped texting me back, then compared them to days he'd checked in with them. I reached out to my sister first, not with accusations, just questions. I asked her to forward me screenshots of what he'd sent her. She hesitated, then did. The messages were calm, concerned, carefully worded. He never said I was unstable outright. He let people reach that conclusion themselves. Next, I talked to my manager. I told her I was dealing with a controlling partner and asked plainly who had called the store. She looked uncomfortable, then confirmed it had been him. She apologized for not checking with me first. I didn't ask her to do anything else. I just thanked her and wrote it down. At home, I let Mark talk. I asked him questions that sounded harmless. What made you worry about me that day? Who did you tell about that? He liked explaining himself. He didn't notice I was building a timeline. I also started saying no to small things. Not emotionally, logistically. I can't lend money this week. I already made plans. Each time, he reacted the same way. Calm voice, subtle digs, reminders of how difficult I'd been lately. I saved those messages too. The last piece came from one of his coworkers, a guy I barely knew. He ran into me at the store and asked awkwardly if things were better at home. When I asked what he meant, he froze. Then admitted Mark had told him I had episodes and needed patience. That was enough. I didn't expose him online. I didn't yell. I simply stopped covering for him. I met my sister for coffee and showed her everything: screenshots, notes, dates. She went quiet, then angry in a way I hadn't seen before. I asked my manager for a short meeting and calmly explained the situation. I showed her proof that the call about my well-being was part of a pattern. She documented it and told me, clearly, that any further contact from him would be inappropriate. Then I told Mark I needed space. Not a fight, just space. I moved my essentials out while he was at work, left the apartment clean, and wrote a short note saying I needed time to think. He panicked. The messages came fast, loving at first, then worried, then sharp. He asked if I was okay, if I was confused again, if someone was putting ideas in my head. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded a small selection of his messages to the people he'd spoken to about me. Not commentary, just timestamps and words, lined up clearly. I let his own voice do the work. The fallout didn't explode. It settled, slowly and publicly, in a way he couldn't control. My sister called him first. She didn't argue or accuse. She asked him why his concern for me always happened behind my back. He tried to explain, But without me there to frame as unstable, his words sounded thin. A friend I hadn't heard from in months reached out and apologized. She said she hadn't realized how one-sided the information had been. Others followed. Not dramatically, just quietly, one by one. At work, my manager kept her distance from the situation, but the tone changed. No more careful looks, no more questions about my home life. When Mark tried to call the store again, he was told firmly not to. He showed up at my sister's place once, unannounced. She didn't let him in. She told him he needed to leave and that contacting me through others was not okay. He left without arguing. That was the part that stuck with me. He only pushed where he thought he had leverage. Without it, he faded. A mutual friend later told me he was telling people I'd turned cold and cut him off without explanation. But the concern was gone from his voice, replaced with irritation. The caring version of him didn't work anymore. I didn't correct his story. I didn't need to. The people who mattered had already seen enough. Living alone again felt strange at first. Too quiet. I noticed how often I waited for my phone to buzz, how often I second-guessed simple choices. That didn't disappear overnight, but the fog lifted faster than I expected. I laughed without checking myself. I wore clothes without commentary. I made plans without preparing explanations in advance. The revenge wasn't watching him suffer. It was watching his control evaporate once the truth existed in plain sight. He didn't lose his job. He didn't face public shame. He just lost access to me, and with it, the story that kept him safe. I learned something important through all of it. Toxic people don't need you to be weak. They just need you to doubt yourself long enough to speak for you. When I stopped reacting and started documenting, the power shifted quietly, permanently. Now, when someone says they're just worried about me, I listen closely, not to the words, but to who they choose to say them to. That's the difference between care and control.